The Green Bay Packers have a history of hitting in undrafted free agency. Could they be at it again? America's guest, Jason Hirschhorn, joins us on today's show.
You are Locked On Packers, your daily Green Bay Packers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Packers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Peter Bukowski, and I cover the Packers for The Leap, a newsletter I would love for you to subscribe to. Follow me on Twitter, Peter_Bukowski. Follow the podcast on Twitter, Locked On Packers. Like us on Facebook. Subscribe to the podcast to iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you find podcasts. You will find Locked On Packers, the #1 Packers podcast on the internet. And the show for fans who know what happened, they want to know why and how, thanks to everyone who makes Locked On Packers their first listen every day. We hope you like starting your day with us as much as we like starting our day with you. Today's episode brought to you by our friends at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. The Green Bay Packers seem to do it every year. They find an undrafted free agent who can come in and contribute in some sort of meaningful way. And every year, going back a while now, Jason Hirschhorn has always been our go-to resource for identifying those players. He writes a UDFA prospectus every year and is usually dead on about how this is going to go. We did record this before we found out Trent Jones, one of the UDFA tackles from Michigan, is going to move to the reserve retired list. And so that's interesting because Jason did not put him in the prospectus. And so he's right again. Like, this is just the perfect example of why he is such a valuable resource. And there's actually some really, really interesting players to talk about. At least two guys that I think will make this team. Two of them, I think have a chance to start on this team. That is a crazy idea in some ways, but when we talk about them, it's not going to seem crazy. So let's get into our conversation with Jason. Joining me now, America's guest, back again this 2024 offseason, Jason Hirschhorn from The Leap, a newsletter we would love for you to subscribe to. And Jason, before we get to the 2024 UDFA prospectus, which is what you're here to talk about, let's go back for a second because we spent a lot of time last year talking about that UDFA prospectus, and in particular, Brenton Cox. How would you evaluate like his season? Because he did make the team, he did get a little bit of run there. But what do you make of where he is so far in his development?
Well, he made the 53-man roster, which, that part may seem obvious, but not all of these players who we feature in the UDFA prospectus that stick in Green Bay make that initial 53-man roster. A lot of them have to go through the waiver process, pass, come to the practice squad, and then at some point during the season, move onto the 53-man roster. So he actually started from a pretty favorable position from that perspective. But then, we all saw the season. He did not play very much. So on some level, it is an incomplete, but we know they're transitioning to a different defense with a different defensive front. He's going to be moving down more to, quote unquote, in the trenches, something he did in college. So I feel pretty optimistic about what he can do in this new system. But beyond that, it's kind of tabula rasa. Like, we just haven't seen enough of him to really project what he's going to do, just the opportunities that we think he's going to get.
As I was reading this year's prospectus, it struck me that we just really had from last year Brenton Cox be someone that was on the minds of Packer fans even a little bit after like the first week of training camp. There's a chance, and I don't think it's a long shot, that at least two and maybe all three of the guys that you highlighted this year in the prospectus make the team. Just let's start there. Like, do you think that's fair?
That they could, yes. At the same time, as I wrote in the prospectus, this is the year more than any other since I've been doing the UDFA prospectus that I'm fearful that there will not be a UDFA that is retained at least on the active roster. Now, you look at the numbers again. we talk about this every year we do this podcast, and I talk about it every year in the prospectus. It is more about what your opportunities appear to be than what you are individually as a player. There are some times when you have a more talented player in a vacuum that basically has no shot because he's buried on the depth chart. And the numbers this year, from the perspective of UDFA, are pretty horrendous. I put this in the story. There are 60 players, 60 players, who either have 2 or fewer years of NFL experience, like accrued years. That means that they entered the NFL within the last 2 cycles,
Sure.
or were extended since the start of 2022. Figuring that if you're extended, like Rashawn Gary and Elton Jenkins, your spot's pretty secure. So 60 players. Not all of them are obviously going to be retained, but that is a bigger number than any team in the NFL.
Wow.
So it is going to be extremely difficult for this particular crop of UDFA players to actually make this team. And that's, I think, a big part why there were only 8 initially signed by Green Bay.
All right, let me flip this, because Donovan Jennings is the guy that, to me, is the most interesting. Offensive lineman from South Florida. He was someone who met with them multiple times in the pre-draft process. All the athletic numbers that they look for, he checks the boxes. In fact, I thought he would be a late round pick of theirs. And they gave him $100,000 of bonus to come and be a Packer as part of this UDFA class. That is a pretty strong signal, though it's not a guarantee. $100,000 in what is the salary cap? $250 million. Like, it's not a lot of money, but it is not no money either. Tell me about Donovan Jennings.
Well, a bit of point of clarification. It is $100,000 guaranteed of salary. And the reason why that's an important difference is if he were to be released and another team were to sign him, there's offset language there. So that money is guaranteed to be paid by somebody, not necessarily Green Bay. There is a signing bonus, though. It is in the 5 figures. That's a lot for Green Bay. So this is definitely someone that they viewed as a draftable player. I put that in the story too. Like, in the 7th round, they probably saw Michael Pratt and later Kalen King and said, well, we can't pass on these guys at this point. And that's how someone, from their perspective, like Donovan Jennings, doesn't get drafted. But after the draft is over and he's still available, that's why you can see them throw these sort of assets financially at him. Now, in a lot of ways, and I know your listeners are familiar with this, he looks like a Packers type offensive lineman. He's about 6'5". He's in that like 310 to 320 range. He's mostly play tackle, but he can play guard, which means he has versatility there. Like, how this goes. He's someone who, if he's going to make the roster or if he's going to make the practice squad, is going to have to play multiple positions to play them at least reasonably well. And at least athletically, that's something he's able to do.
All right, more with our conversation with Jason Hirschhorn coming up in just a second here on Locked On Packers. We are going to get the schedule imminently. I expect us to be hearing today about the leaks, about the games that are going to be happening. And that means you are going to want to get your tickets. Do it with Game Time. Game Time is the way to get especially last minute tickets. But if you want to plan, it's a good thing for that too. Last minute tickets, flash deals, zone deals, easy to find and buy NFL tickets for every kind of game that you might want to go to. An away game, a home game, whatever you want to do. With the lowest price guarantee, event cancellation protection, and job loss protection, they got you covered if something comes up. Plus, views from your seat. Get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, the lowest price guaranteed. We'll get back to Jason in just a second. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories in sports without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yeah, when you look at the numbers that the Packers tend to like, he sort of checks every box athletically. And that was one of the reasons why I thought he might be a late round pick here. But you do mention in the piece, and I think this is an important clarification, that you had someone else at a similar spot that other fans might be, especially Big Ten fans, might be a little bit more familiar with. Why did you go Donovan Jennings over the player you passed on, and who was that one?
So that was Trent Jones, the offensive lineman from Michigan. Now, he is not as much of an athlete as Donovan Jennings. He's still an above average athlete, both at tackle and at guard, but not quite to the level of Jennings. That's a factor. I thought the bigger factor, though, was the amount of time these two players have played. Jennings has played a lot of games. By comparison, Trent Jones, I think, had like 13 starts, and a few of those were like as a sixth offensive lineman, like officially a tight end. Just a very different situation.
That is, sorry, I have to interrupt you. That is so Jim Harbaugh, that he had offensive linemen with starts as their sixth offensive lineman. That I just like, that's almost too on the nose.
It's something we might have to come back to later in the season when the Chargers come to town. But we to these players, it came down to, okay, one of these guys has more experience and not by a small degree. He has more athleticism and not by a small degree. And you look at those financial commitments that the Packers made, that's a pretty big difference between him and all of the other undrafted free agents they signed. So you put those all together and said, okay, this guy, he's not guaranteed anything, right? Like we may not talk about him much after, the beginning of August, but we're projecting paths here. They invested a fair amount in him. There's an opportunity there. I'd even put this in the piece just to keep the story length somewhat reasonable. They only retained one undrafted free agent along the offensive line last year, and that was a practice squad player, Kadeem Telford. And he already lost his number. I'm not saying it's an indication of what his opportunities are.
That seems not great.
Seems not great, right? So they want to restock there. Like this is a big part of the way they build their line. It's not just those draft picks, although obviously that's the biggest individual component. It's getting those guys on the cheap as undrafted free agents and developing them over several years. They didn't really do that last year the way that they normally do. So bring someone in like Jennings, who again should be able to handle multiple positions. That's a pretty good starting point.
You have a special teams only player on this list, and I'll be honest, I was pretty excited when they signed him, because the idea of having competent long snap play for seemingly the first time since like Rob Davis with Peter Bowden, the long snapper from Wisconsin, whether or not he makes this team, we'll see. But this has been an issue now for a number of seasons, going back to when Brian Gutekunst used an actual draft pick on multiple special teamers just a couple of seasons ago.
Well, first of all, this is Brett Good erasure, and I think you should apologize for that. But no, it has been a long time, and Brian Gutekunst in particular has clearly made a huge effort to fix this and hasn't been successful. It's actually one of the most glaring red flags in his resume as a GM right now, because as you pointed out, he spent a draft pick, a 7th round pick, not a huge investment, but any draft pick for a long snapper is huge. They've also, they signed this past season the Rams former long snapper, guy with experience, Super Bowl experience. That was actually the second former Rams long snapper that has become their long snapper. And as I, highlighted in the article without using his name, that ended up leading to some pretty disastrous outcomes in the playoffs for Green Bay. So it is a huge, huge issue, which also means this is an area of opportunity for UDFA. Now, I don't know about you, Peter. I do not scout long snappers. Like the degree to which I scout any player, it's mostly the ones that we see down to down, not the long snappers, punters, kickers, etc. But by most accounts,
you just don't love the grind enough, Jason.
No, clearly not. But by most accounts, Peter Bowden, the Wisconsin long snapper, was the best, or at least one of the best options in this rookie class.
Yeah.
So you say, okay, that's a guy who coming out of college looks like he's going to be able to stick with somebody. Green Bay clearly has an opening for that spot, or at least is going to have an open competition for that spot. That's probably a big reason why Peter Bowden signed with Green Bay. It's not because he played at Wisconsin. It's because that's a job he thinks that he can win.
Yeah.
So again, we judge the path first before we judge anything else. There's an opportunity there. This appears to be one of the better long snappers in this class, if not the best in this class. That bodes well for him. And, Rich Bisaccia, we know, has a lot of influence on how this 53-man roster is going to look like. And you add all those things together, it's like, yeah, there actually is a road for him, not just to, make the 53-man roster this year, but maybe be the long-term solution that Green Bay's been waiting for years now.
And what a terrific name, Peter B. Just tremendous stuff there. I not that I think Matthias Winston, who has a great name, like Matthias Winston is just like S tier name. He's the third guy that you mentioned. And if I recall correctly, you were the one that broke the story of the Packers signing Matthias Winston. But what I thought was really interesting about the way that you framed this one was not necessarily because I think he's a particularly interesting player, but because of his intriguing size relative to the new special teams rules. Can you explain this?
Yeah, so the Packers obviously have invested pretty heavily in tight end the last few years. It's not just those multiple day 2 picks they spent in 2023 on Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft. They picked up Ben Sims off of the waiver wire during final
Nice
cuts.
player.
It turned out to be like a pretty useful player. They brought back this offseason Tyler Davis coming off an ACL, someone who had been a special teams ace for them in the
My
past.
favorite, Tyler Davis.
But yeah, of course, we'll get into that at some point, I'm sure. But the difference here is that Messiah Swinson is actually a pretty poor athlete by NFL standards, but he is gigantic. He is over 6'7". He is just a shade under 260. These are useful traits in a lot of areas. Now, they're not necessarily going to be useful traits when you're talking about, stretching the field like some of these other tight ends can. But on the new kickoffs, you're going to have more, guys who are big enough to block. Like they have some offensive lineman-esque traits, but they're not offensive linemen because they're going to have to move. That's where Swinson becomes particularly interesting. This is going to be, more than anything else, like the first offensive play of a series, because it basically looks like, depending on how you formulate it, a running play. A guy who can block on the edge has a lot of value in that. And he may not be able to move as well as the other tight ends, but he can move a lot better than an offensive lineman. That's going to be key for him. And also just that size in the red zone is going to have value. As it turns out, really difficult to cover a guy who can touch the sky. So you look at all those things together, and yeah, he doesn't have a great path. Again, they've made those big investments in tight end before, but I do think there's a real chance they're going to keep more tight end body types. Some of those might be linebackers, may not be an actual tight end, but there's going to be more guys that they'll consider for that 53-man roster this time around relative to what it's been in the past. And, he offers some unique traits in that regard. So yeah, there's not a lot blocking him. Like, we know those 2 draft picks from last year, they're, health permitting, going to make the team. Ben Sims and Tyler Davis both have good chances to make the team as well. That's only 4 guys, though. If they want to keep some extra guys there for kickoffs, Swinson is right there with Joel Wilson, someone who they have on the 90-man roster, but hasn't actually played for them. Some of those extra linebacker types. Again, they didn't even have many linebackers going into the draft. So I think there's a path there for him. He's going to have to show it, obviously, in training camp and during the preseason, but it's at least something. And in this UDFA class, like, you kind of have to squint a little bit after the first few guys.
And all right, still more to come with America's guest, our pal, Jason Hirschhorn, in just a second. Today's episode brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. The Pacers, they've evened their series with the banged up Knicks. That's 2-2. You've got the Nuggets and the Wolves. That series looked over. And now that one's knotted up 2-2. And the Cavaliers, even without Donovan Mitchell, had their shot to knot that series up 2-2. The Celtics survived. But does anyone have confidence in the Celtics right now? I'd like to fade the Celtics right now. And right now, speaking of right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, puck lines. It's the hockey playoffs, all that good stuff. It's all there for you at FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today, now available on the free Fire TV channels app.
And to your point about the difference between offensive lineman body types and tight end body types, you mentioned he's 6'7", 260. But if you just take away the weight, everything else says offensive lineman. He has 34-inch arms. That is like no doubt offensive tackle arms. And he's got almost 11-inch hands. Like those are Kawhi Leonard, like those are monster mitts. So from a blocking standpoint, if that's what you're looking for, that's why this is such an interesting idea. And I loved his addition in this piece. Let's pivot here for a second, because we just had Jim Nagy on to talk about some of these Senior Bowl guys. You and I had a long conversation a couple months ago about quarterbacks and the day 3 guys that the Packers target. And I asked you, hey, could the Packers get a little crazy and take someone like Michael Pratt in the 3rd or 4th round? And you said, I don't think so. That's not a good management of resources. We agreed on that piece. And somehow he fell to the 7th round. I want your reaction to the Packers acquisition of Michael Pratt. And then so we can bring this all back full circle here.
So when Green Bay came on the board in the 7th round with Pratt still there, I was convinced, more than I think I've been convinced of any pick that they might make, that he was going to be the guy. And it's for all the reasons that you mentioned. Like, he hits every one of those benchmarks that we identified in that quarterback article. He is someone who, even if day 2 was a bit of a pipe dream, just because pretty much anybody who might have gone in the first 100 picks got pushed up, and this happens in most years, pushed up.
17 quarterbacks went in the first 12 picks, so that made it difficult.
Yeah, so if you're not in that group, you sort of get pushed back. Like, it's a polarizing dynamic there. But he's still someone, again, he had the size. He's a really good athlete for the position. Any weakness you want to poke at him, like he doesn't have the greatest arm. He still has a pretty good arm. This is not a true weakness. He's just weak relative to some of his other strengths. Played a lot of football at Tulane. He's probably the primary reason that program had so much success, other than Willie Fritz, the head coach at the time, the last few years. So you add those things together, it's basically catnip for Green Bay and Brian Gutekunst. So not only do I think that he has a chance to unseat Sean Clifford, like, no one's saying that he's going to do anything with Jordan Love, health permitting, but this is someone who I think, if he makes a 53-man roster and if he sees playing time, whether it's, an injury relief or during garbage time, I think he can perform. Like, his skill set really bodes well in an offense like Green Bay has. And, you can never truly predict this, but if anyone they were going to draft this year quarterback was going to become a trade piece, maybe 2 years down the line, I think it's him. Like, he really checks a lot of those boxes. So if you're a Green Bay fan and you want to see them get back into the habit of taking late round quarterbacks, developing them, and then flipping them for draft picks, Michael Pratt is almost the ideal outcome.
Yeah, it did seem impossible that he would be there in the 7th, even if like the 3rd round, 4th round might have been a little rich for him. But we've seen this play out. I don't want to put the Matt Hasselbeck comparisons on him. That's just not fair to someone that went in the 7th round and has never played a snap of NFL football. But it is good, and it's why I liked that you did the piece, this perspective of, hey, this is what the Packers have done forever. Were you surprised that Brian Gutekunst gave us as much information about what he was going to do as he did? Like, in retrospect, now, like, he told us he was going to draft a quarterback. Like, he did give a lot of hints about how this draft was going to look.
I was surprised at the time that he did it, right? Like, the question, if you go back, because this happened during the owners meeting, or at the combine rather, was like, it was about Sean Clifford. And then
that was the best part.
He answered it. Like, he did give some information about Sean Clifford. And he's like, actually, we want to draft quarterbacks in the late rounds on a more regular basis.
Yeah, he cut himself off to give the answer about wanting to draft a quarterback.
Like, he really couldn't contain his excitement. And it's one of those things where, like, yeah, we know that teams will give bad information intentionally to confuse other GMs, but there really is no benefit there. Like, no one is saying, oh, the Packers said they might take a late round quarterback, we got to draft him in round 3 now. Like, it wasn't really going to turn into a strategic advantage. So it really seemed like he was genuinely excited to bring back this practice. And look, his actions backed it up. Sean Clifford last year Michael Pratt this year, those guys are battling it out for at least one roster. I guess it's possible that they could have two, but we've seen their track record. Like most likely there'll be two quarterbacks on the 53, and it's going to be one of those late round guys. But Sean Clifford looked good last year. Like he actually played not a ton, but he looked good in those moments. He actually threw down the field and had a big completion, I believe, to Bo Melton. So he's coming in with experience, not just from college, but from a full year in the NFL. Michael Pratt obviously does not have that yet, but he comes with a ton of experience from Tulane. And it's actually going to be a genuinely exciting quarterback battle, even though, health permitting, it's going to have no impact on the starting offense.
Yeah, if you told Packers fans last year that there was going to be a really exciting preseason QB battle heading into this season, you'd be going, oh, Jordan Love must not have played well at all. And it's like totally the opposite. So somehow they managed to thread that needle. Jason, appreciate the time. Go read the UDFA prospectus, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks, man.
Take care, Peter.
All right, we'll have Jason back on the program soon, I am sure. So much more to get to as we roll through the spring. Mandatory minicamp is around the corner. A Jordan Love extension is going to be around the corner. Jared Goff just got the bag, which must make Jordan Love and his agents pretty happy. This could get weird. It could be a number. I mean, the number is going to start with a 5 in terms of APY. Let's see what happens from there. I can't wait. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the Packers structure it. If they go outside their normal structure, what is this going to look like? What is this going to look like? We're going to talk about it. I'm sure we will talk about all of it coming up soon on Locked On Packers, plus our rookie orientation series coming down the pike. So much more as we move through the offseason. Still 5 days a week. It's what we do here on Locked On Packers. We are for the sickos. So thank you very much for being a part of what we do here. Back tomorrow. Follow me on Twitter, Peter_Bukowski. Follow the podcast on Twitter, Locked On Packers. Like us on Facebook. Subscribe to all of the things. On Instagram, we're there, Locked On Packers. On TikTok, we're there, Locked On Packers. You guys are crushing the social content right now. Facebook, I mentioned. Go subscribe over on YouTube so you can stay Locked On Packers.